Hi, and welcome to the CanyonChasers Garage. Today we're going to be talking about changing your brake pads on your motorcycle. Now, it must be said that if you don't feel 100% confident doing this task on your own, please take your motorcycle to a certified technician. Stopping a motorcycle is pretty gosh darn important. We also highly recommend that you refer to your motorcycle's factory service manual before taking on this task. But with that said, this is a fairly straightforward task, so it should be pretty easy for most average home mechanics. There's a few things about the brake caliper we need to be aware of before we start. The first is how the caliper is mounted to the fork leg. This is your newer modern style. It's called a radial mount. The bolts are mounted like the same direction as the spoke on the wheel. They're mounted radially. The older style, the bolts are mounted transversely. It's not really relevant for this procedure other than knowing how to get the caliper off of the fork leg. The other part is there's going to be one or two pins that actually hold the brake pads in place, and there's going to be a big giant spring. It's a flat piece of metal that sits on the back side of the brake caliper that needs to come off. Some service manuals tell you need to replace all of these parts in conjunction. However, our experience has been that if the motorcycle is in good condition and fairly good shape and hasn't received any damage, you can usually use the same pins and spring. Now, depending on the style of caliper you have itself, you're going to either have one or two pins that hold the brake pads in place. This Brembo uses two pins to hold the pads in place, but a more common design you see on Nissan brakes and Tokiko brakes, it will be a single pin that goes through the middle. If it has the single pin that goes through the middle, it usually will need to be removed with a screwdriver, in which case you want to loosen the pin before you take the caliper off the motorcycle. Not take it all the way up, but just loosen it. In this case, where these pins come out freely, we're going to start by just removing the brake caliper. Now, to take the caliper off, we're going to start by just loosening and removing the caliper bolts. We're going to use just a standard ratchet and an 8mm hex socket, and we're just going to remove it. Now, these bolts really shouldn't be super tight. Depending on your service manual, they're usually going to be in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 foot-pounds, depending on the motorcycle. So they should come out fairly easy. If they are extremely tight and hard to get out, the odds are the last person that installed the brake caliper put them on too tightly. This is why it's really important to own a service manual and a torque wrench so that you don't over-tighten bolts. One of the most common mistakes we see on motorcycles is that bolts will be over-tightened, which tends to damage the threads and strip the heads of bolts, which makes working on your motorcycle much more difficult. Now, once the bolts are out, we want to be really careful removing the caliper from the rotor. We don't want to twist or hoik on it because we don't want to bend the rotor itself. So we're just going to be very gentle and just kind of work our way out and wait till the pads clear the rotor and then just kind of slip it out just like that. Now, we try to keep our motorcycles clean, but even despite that, you'll notice there's a lot of black brake dust all over this, and this is normal. But rather than just take the old pads out and put new pads in, we want to take some time to clean the brake dust off, and this will ensure that our brake calipers continue to work as efficiently as possible. So to remove the pads, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a pair of needle nose pliers and we're going to pull out these tiny little cotter pins. Don't lose these. There should be one for each pin, and we're going to pull those out. And they shouldn't be sticky or anything like that, so you just kind of grab them. Once the cotter pins are out, you should be able to just take these pins, and very gently you're going to be able to just work them out. They're just going to slide out nice and gently. You want to be careful not to grab by the part that's inside the brake caliper, because the brake pads actually slide on that part. We want to keep that in as good a shape as possible. So just kind of take your time and work them out. Now, before you pull out the pin, the last pin the rest of the way, hold onto this spring so it doesn't go shooting across the garage, and just kind of grab the pin and pull it out. Once that pin's out, the spring is just going to come out, and then the pads should just fall out the bottom. So now with the brake pads removed, we can see how dirty it is in there, and you can see the circle things that kind of come in. When we squeeze on the brake lever, what it's doing is pushing fluid into the caliper and pushes these pucks in, which squeezes the brake pads up against the rotor. Now, we want to clean all this brake dust out before we push the pucks back in. If we were just to push the pucks back in now, it would take all that brake dust and contaminants and take it inside the caliper with it, sometimes damaging the seals and putting contaminants into the caliper itself. So we're going to clean the dust out. Most people will just tend to go grab the brake cleaner, and we don't like to use that. We feel that the brake cleaner is just far too harsh. So we like to use a mixture of just simple dish soap and water and a toothbrush to clean all of the brake dust out of there. Now you'll notice we put the gloves on because this is going to get dirty, and we're just going to simply spray the dish soap onto the caliper And it's going to get nice and messy, and we're going to use the help of a retired toothbrush, and we're just going to get in there and we're just going to clean everything up really good. Use the dish soap to rinse as you go and keep flushing all the brake dust out of there. All right, these are the pins that hold the brake pads actually in place. We want to clean off all of the brake dust and grime that's on these as well, because the cleaner these are, the easier time the pads will have sliding over it to actuate and to release off of your rotor. So one thing we found that works really well is we start with the dish soap, and then we go to just some good old-fashioned emery cloth and clean them up, and they'll be looking lickety-split in just a second. Once the pins are clean, the next thing we want to do is we want to go back to our caliper, and we should be able to take these pucks with our fingers and just push them back into place. Push them nice and slow, and they should slide right back into the body of the caliper itself. And this will make actually the final assembly go a lot smoother when we push these back in. You'll notice when you push on one of the others will move, so you sometimes have to get all your fingers in there and just kind of push everything until everything kind of goes back into place. But if they don't move freely, that usually means you have to do some more cleaning. But now you'll notice that the pucks are back in place. Take your new brake pads, and they should just slide into place, typically with the little windows towards the top, because that's where the pins hold it in place. Slide them in, and then once they're up into place, it's just a matter of putting the spring back in with the pins. So we'll start by putting the spring back into place, like that, and then we'll take our pins and just slide everything back together, like so. Now that our caliper is back together, the last thing you may want to consider cleaning, and we highly recommend it, is to clean the rotor itself. You can look at this rotor. This bike lives on the track. It lives a hard life, and you can see how the rotor is all discolored, and that's from brake pad material actually getting inside the metal. So this is where you would actually use your brake cleaner, use your brake cleaner spray on a rag and wipe down the rotor, or if you want to get more aggressive than that, which we're going to have to do in this case, you can actually use some sandpaper and lightly go over the rotor with a sandpaper, and that'll bring them back. Reassembly is just the opposite of taking it apart. Take your time, put everything back where it goes. Don't forget the little cotter pins that go into the pins. Make sure you get those back into place. And then when you tighten the retaining bolts, please look at your manufacturer's recommendations for the torque settings. We really don't want to over tighten these, and we see that all the time. It's really not all that tight. Once everything's back together, you'll need to break in your brake pads, just like you break in a new tire. So one of the old rules of thumb that we heard for years was do 25 stops from 25 miles an hour, and that helps bed the pads into the rotors and everything starts mating and working together. You can also look at the back of the brake pads for any specific recommendations based on that brake pad. Some brands have different braking procedures. Well, those are the basics on how to change the brake pads in your motorcycle. The rear brake pads are going to be essentially the exact same process as the front. Please take your time, be patient, and don't force anything. Thanks for watching. Please be sure to check out CanyonChasers.net for more how-to videos, travel logs, product reviews, and much, much more.